Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Let's get straight into the true scary stories. Story 1. The Whispering Dark. It was the kind of night where darkness seemed to swallow everything, an oppressive blackness that made the air feel thick and heavy. I had always been a night owl, thriving in the silence and solitude of the late hours, but something about this night felt different. It wasn't just the stillness or the absence of the usual nocturnal sounds. It was a deeper, more sinister silence, like the world was holding its breath. I thought the phrase dead of night was just a poetic exaggeration until I heard them. I had settled into bed around midnight, the soft rustle of leaves outside my window usually a comforting lullaby. My small house, nestled deep in the woods, had always felt like a sanctuary. But tonight, as I drifted between wakefulness and sleep, I began to hear something else beneath the familiar sounds. At first, it was just a whisper, so faint I thought it was the wind. But the longer I listened, the more distinct it became. Voices, low and murmuring, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to make sense of the words. They were too muffled, too garbled, but their intent was unmistakable. These were not the sounds of the living. My skin prickled with an icy dread, the kind that starts at the base of your spine and slowly creeps up to the back of your neck. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and peered out the window into the inky darkness. There was nothing out there, at least nothing I could see. But the voices continued, rising and falling in a cadence that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, a trick of a half-dreaming mind. But the fear was too real, too immediate. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the room with their eerie, disembodied presence. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, more for comfort than utility. What was I going to do? Call the police and tell them I was being haunted by whispers? As I clutched the device, the voices grew louder, more insistent, as if they knew I was trying to reach out for help. The air in the room turned cold, a frigid wave that made my breath visible in the dim light. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The abrupt silence was deafening, leaving a ringing in my ears. For a brief moment, I thought maybe it was over, that whatever had invaded my home had decided to leave. But then, I heard it, a single word, clear and unmistakable, spoken directly into my ear, though I was alone in the room. Come. My blood ran cold as the word echoed in my mind, the tone neither threatening nor pleading, but something in between. It was a command, a summons from beyond the grave. I didn't want to obey, didn't want to know what awaited me in the darkness outside my window. But the pull was undeniable, like a magnet drawing me towards an inevitable, horrifying conclusion. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. I don't remember getting out of bed. One moment I was frozen in place, my body rigid with fear, and the next, I was standing by the window, staring into the void outside. My breath fogged up the glass, and I wiped it away with trembling fingers, expecting to see something, anything, moving in the darkness. But there was nothing. Just the black expanse of the forest, a tangle of shadows and moonlight that played tricks on my eyes. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The word "come" still lingered in my mind, gnawing at my sanity. It wasn't just a word, it was a lure, a hook that had embedded itself deep in my consciousness. I knew I shouldn't go outside. Every instinct screamed at me to lock the doors, hide under the covers, and wait for daylight. But the more I tried to resist, the stronger the pull became. As if in a trance, I found myself reaching for the latch on the window, my hand moving of its own accord. The cold metal felt alive under my fingers, vibrating with an unseen energy. I hesitated for a moment, my heart thudding so loudly in my chest that I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. But before I could stop myself, I turned the latch and pushed the window open. The night air rushed in, bringing with it a scent that was both familiar and foreign. It smelled of earth and decay, of something ancient and forgotten. The whispers returned, now louder and more urgent, as if they were impatient with my hesitation. They spoke in unison, a chorus of voices overlapping and intertwining, creating a sound that was both beautiful and horrifying. I leaned out the window, peering into the darkness, my eyes straining to catch a glimpse of the source. The trees loomed like twisted sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, a flicker of pale light among the shadows. My heart skipped a beat, and I squinted, trying to focus. But the light was gone, leaving only the oppressive darkness. Just as I was about to pull back, I heard a soft rustling sound, like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. It was coming from the edge of the forest, where the trees met the clearing around my house. The sound grew louder, closer, until I could make out the distinct crunch of footsteps on the gravel path leading up to my door. My stomach twisted in fear, and I felt a scream rising in my throat, but I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. At first, it was just a silhouette, a dark shape against the backdrop of the trees. But as it came closer, the moonlight caught its features, and I realized with a jolt of terror that I recognized it. The figure was me, an exact replica, down to the clothes I was wearing. It walked with a slow, deliberate pace, its eyes locked onto mine with a cold, vacant stare. Panic surged through me, breaking the paralysis that had held me in place. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to echo inside my skull. The figure outside stopped at the foot of the steps leading up to my front door and tilted its head, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. And then, it smiled. A cruel, twisted smile that sent a wave of nausea crashing over me. The whispers coalesced into a single word, spoken in a voice that was unmistakably my own: "Come." The figure raised a hand and pointed directly at me, its expression never changing, as if it knew I had no choice but to obey. I slammed the window shut with trembling hands, the wooden frame rattling as I locked it, though I knew deep down that a simple barrier wouldn't stop what was outside. The figure, my figure, continued to stare up at me with that unnatural smile, its hand still outstretched as if beckoning me to join it. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the truth was too impossible, too horrifying to accept. My own doppelganger standing outside in the dead of night? The thought was absurd, but the evidence was right there, staring at me with cold, dead eyes. And those whispers, they were louder now, filling my head with their incessant, maddening chant. Each syllable felt like a needle piercing my thoughts, unraveling the last threads of my sanity. I backed away from the window, clutching my head as if I could physically push the voices out. But they followed me, wrapping around my consciousness like a shroud, suffocating me with their terrible persistence. They weren't just voices, they were thoughts, ideas, memories that weren't mine but felt like they should be. Fragmented images flashed through my mind, dark woods, an ancient, crumbling stone, blood-stained hands, and that same twisted smile reflected back at me from a surface I couldn't see. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the din of the whispers. I wasn't sure if I was asking the figure outside or the voices in my head, but either way, I received no answer. The figure remained motionless, its gaze unyielding, as if it was waiting for something, waiting for me. With a sudden burst of defiance, I shook my head, forcing myself to move away from the window. "No," I muttered, trying to drown out the voices with my own words. "I'm not going out there." "I'm not," but the rest of my protest was swallowed by a wave of dizziness that nearly knocked me off my feet. I stumbled, catching myself on the edge of the bed as the room spun around me. A low, mocking laugh echoed through the room, and I realized with a jolt that it was coming from outside. The figure was laughing at me, its expression unchanged, but the sound was unmistakable. My stomach twisted with a mix of fear and anger. I didn't know what this thing was or why it looked like me, but I knew one thing for certain: it wanted me outside, and it wouldn't stop until I obeyed. The thought of going out there, of confronting that twisted reflection of myself, filled me with dread. But the pull was stronger now, a physical force that seemed to drag me towards the door. My feet moved without my consent, carrying me down the hall towards the front of the house. I tried to resist, tried to stop, but my body was no longer my own. It was as if I was being puppeteered by some unseen force, my limbs jerking in unnatural, stilted movements. I reached the front door and gripped the handle, my knuckles white with the effort of trying to pull away. "This isn't real," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. This can't be real. But even as I said the words, I knew they were a lie. The cold metal beneath my hand, the laughter still ringing in my ears, the whispers that had become a dull roar, this was real, and it was happening to me. With a final, desperate effort, I tried to turn away, but it was no use. My hand twisted the doorknob, and the door creaked open, revealing the figure standing on the porch. It was closer now, its smile wider, more grotesque. The air around it seemed to shimmer, distorting the space between us like a heat haze, though the night was cold. I stepped out onto the porch, my breath visible in the frigid air, and the door swung shut behind me with a soft click. The figure stepped back, giving me space as if inviting me to join it on the path. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I saw something flicker behind that vacant stare, a glimmer of triumph. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a single voice, clear and distinct in the icy night air. "Welcome home," it said, and this time, it wasn't just my voice, it was mine, but laced with something else, something older and far more dangerous. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, I followed the figure down the path, my feet moving of their own accord, my mind trapped in a waking nightmare. The path ahead was a winding trail of darkness, illuminated only by slivers of moonlight that managed to pierce through the dense canopy above. The forest, once a place of serene isolation, now felt like a living entity, the trees leaning in as if they were whispering secrets to one another, their gnarled branches pointing the way forward. The figure, my figure, moved ahead with unsettling grace, gliding over the uneven ground as if it was one with the shadows. I trailed behind it, my legs moving mechanically, the last vestiges of my resistance crushed by the relentless pull of whatever force had taken hold of me. The whispers had returned, softer now, almost soothing, as they guided me deeper into the woods. But beneath their gentle cadence was an undercurrent of malevolence, a dark promise that chilled me to the bone. The figure glanced over its shoulder, its eyes gleaming in the dim light, and I saw that its face had changed. It was no longer just a mirror of my own features, something ancient and inhuman had seeped into its appearance, warping it into a grotesque parody of myself. The skin was stretched too tight over its bones, and the smile, it was impossibly wide, splitting its face from ear to ear, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. "Where are you taking me?" I managed to croak out, my voice hoarse and trembling. The figure didn't respond, but its smile widened, if that was even possible. It turned away and continued down the path, the shadows closing in around us. I knew I should be terrified, but a strange numbness had settled over me, dulling the edges of my fear. It was as if I was watching everything unfold from a distance, disconnected from my own body. As we walked, the forest seemed to warp and shift around us, the trees bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. The air grew colder, the ground beneath my feet softening into a spongy, damp earth that sucked at my shoes with each step. And then, ahead of us, the path opened up into a clearing, bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone altar, its surface etched with strange symbols that seemed to writhe and pulse in the dim light. Surrounding the altar were dozens of shadowy figures, their forms flickering like candle flames in the wind. They were indistinct, faceless, yet I could feel their eyes on me, their collective gaze heavy with anticipation. The figure that had led me here stopped at the edge of the clearing and turned to face me. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a sudden jolt of pain in my chest, like a string had been pulled tight, tethering me to this place, to these creatures. The whispers rose to a crescendo, drowning out all other sound, and I realized with dawning horror that they weren't just in my head, they were coming from the figures surrounding the altar. "Your place is here," the figure said, its voice a twisted echo of my own. "You belong with us now." It stepped aside, gesturing towards the altar, and I felt an invisible force push me forward, closer to the ancient stone. "No," I gasped, trying to resist, but my body betrayed me, moving towards the altar against my will. The figures around it began to chant, their voices low and guttural, speaking in that same strange language I had heard earlier. The symbols on the altar glowed brighter, casting an unnatural light over the clearing. As I reached the altar, the pain in my chest intensified, spreading through my body like fire. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, as the chanting grew louder, more insistent. The figure, my figure, moved closer, standing over me with that terrible, twisted smile. It reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder, and I felt a surge of cold energy flow through me, freezing my blood in my veins. "Join us," it whispered, its voice filled with a cruel, mocking tone. "Become one with the darkness." I tried to scream, to fight back, but my body was no longer my own. The pain reached a peak, and my vision blurred, the world around me dissolving into shadows. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the figure leaning in close, its eyes blazing with malevolent triumph. And then, everything went black. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The Hollow Scratches. When Max called me about the house, I could hear the excitement in his voice. He'd been talking about buying a place for months, and finally, his persistence paid off. "You have to come over tonight," he insisted. "You won't believe what I found in the backyard." Curiosity piqued, I agreed, packing up a few things before heading over. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the streets as I drove to his new place, an old Victorian manor that had seen better days. The house stood at the end of a long, narrow road, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to whisper with every gust of wind. The moment I stepped out of the car, I felt it, a weight in the air, like the house was watching me. Max greeted me with a wide grin, his face half lit by the fading daylight. "You're going to love this place," he said, waving me inside. The interior was just as eerie as the exterior. Creaking floorboards, the scent of old wood and dust, and a persistent chill that clung to the walls. Max seemed oblivious, dragging me through the rooms with childlike enthusiasm. "Wait till you see the backyard," he said, practically pulling me along. The backyard was vast, overgrown with weeds and encircled by a crooked wooden fence. But what drew my attention was the pet cemetery, a small plot with weathered headstones and crude markers. Some graves were so old that the inscriptions had faded, leaving only faint impressions of names. "This is it," Max said, almost reverently. "The realtor didn't mention it, but I think it's incredible. There's history here." I nodded, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. The sun had nearly set, and the cemetery seemed to take on a life of its own, shadows dancing among the stones. "Do you know anything about the people who lived here before?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Max shrugged. "Not much. The house has been empty for years. The last owners were an elderly couple, and before that, well, who knows? It's just us and the pets now." He laughed, but it felt forced. As we stood there, a sudden rustling came from the woods beyond the fence. Max tensed, his eyes scanning the tree-line. "Probably just a raccoon," he muttered, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. Later that evening, we settled into the living room, beers in hand, trying to shake off the strange vibe. We joked about the house, trying to lighten the mood, but every creak and groan of the old building kept us on edge. Then, just as the conversation lulled, we heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from the back door. Max frowned, setting his drink down. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I nodded, my heart skipping a beat. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to claw its way inside. We exchanged a nervous glance, neither of us willing to say what we were both thinking. Max grabbed a flashlight, and we cautiously made our way to the back door. The scratching stopped abruptly as we approached, leaving us in an eerie silence. Max hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. "Should we open it?" he whispered. I swallowed hard, every instinct screaming at me to say no, but I couldn't find the words. Before I could protest, he swung the door open. The darkness outside seemed to swallow the light from the house. The backyard was empty, the pet cemetery barely visible in the shadows. But the air was thick with something unseen but undeniably there. "Nothing," Max said, exhaling in relief. He stepped outside, peering into the night. I stayed in the doorway, the chill in my bones growing stronger. "Let's go back inside," I urged, my voice trembling. Max nodded, stepping back in and closing the door behind him. But as we turned to leave, the scratching started again, louder this time, coming from right under our feet. The scratching was relentless, like nails dragging across wood. My heart raced as the sound seemed to crawl up the walls, echoing through the house. Max's face paled, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. We both stood frozen, staring at the floor as the noise grew louder, more insistent. It was as if something was trying to claw its way out from beneath us. "Is there a basement?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Max nodded slowly, pointing to a door at the far end of the hall. "I haven't been down there yet," he admitted, his voice shaky. The thought of going down into the dark, unknown space made my stomach churn, but the scratching continued, urging us forward. With every step we took toward the door, the sound grew louder, more desperate. Max hesitated at the basement door, his hand shaking as he reached for the knob. "We have to find out what this is," I said, trying to muster some courage. He nodded, swallowing hard before pushing the door open. The basement was pitch black, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and rot. Max fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened. "Great," he muttered, pulling out his flashlight again. The beam of light barely cut through the darkness as we descended the creaking wooden stairs. The basement was a cluttered mess of old furniture, dusty boxes, and cobwebs. The scratching seemed to be coming from beneath the floorboards, directly under the center of the room. What could be down there? I asked, more to myself than to Max. He shook his head, his expression tense. "Maybe an animal got trapped," he suggested, but we both knew that didn't make sense. The sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. As we searched the basement, Max's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. My nerves were on edge, every sound amplified in the oppressive silence. Suddenly, Max stopped, his beam of light fixed on a spot on the floor. "Here," he said, his voice hoarse. At first, I didn't see what he was pointing at, but then I noticed it, a section of the floorboards that looked newer, as if they had been replaced recently. "Help me move this," Max said, already kneeling down to pry up the boards. With some effort, we managed to lift the boards, revealing a shallow hole beneath. The smell hit us first, a foul, decaying stench that made my stomach turn. But what really caught my eye were the bones. Small, brittle, and unmistakably animal, they were scattered in the dirt like they had been hastily buried. "What the hell is this?" I asked, my voice trembling as I stared at the morbid sight. Max looked just as horrified. "Maybe it was a burial site for pets before the cemetery outside was established," he suggested, though the uncertainty in his voice was clear. But then the scratching started again, this time louder and more frenzied, coming from deeper within the hole. Max jumped back, almost dropping the flashlight. "There's something down there," he gasped, his face pale. Before I could react, the floor beneath us began to shake, a low rumble building from the depths of the earth. The scratching grew louder, and the dirt in the hole started to shift, like something was burrowing its way up to the surface. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, grabbing Max by the arm. But he was rooted to the spot, his eyes wide with terror as he stared into the darkness. Suddenly, the floorboards around the hole splintered, and something black and gnarled shot out from the ground, dragging itself up into the basement. It was too dark to see clearly, but the shape was wrong, twisted and unnatural, like a grotesque mockery of life. Max screamed, stumbling back as the thing began to pull itself free from the earth, its long, clawed fingers raking against the floor. Panic surged through me, and I yanked Max toward the stairs. We bolted up the steps, the creature's horrible scratching following us, echoing in our ears. We slammed the basement door shut behind us, both of us panting in terror. The scratching persisted, more violent and frenzied, like whatever we had disturbed was furious at being unearthed. "What did we just do?" Max gasped, his voice shaking. But before I could answer, a loud thud came from the other side of the door, followed by silence. I glanced at Max, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence was worse than the noise. It meant that whatever was down there had stopped trying to get out, or worse, it had found another way. The silence hung thick in the air, pressing down on us like a shroud. Max and I stood there, backs against the basement door, as if our combined weight could keep whatever was down there from breaking through. "We can't stay here," I whispered, my voice barely holding steady. Max nodded, his face drained of color. "But where do we go?" he asked, desperation lacing his words. The truth was, I had no idea. The house felt like a trap, the walls closing in with every passing second. We cautiously made our way to the living room, both of us jumping at every creak and groan the old house made. The night outside was pitch black, the windows offering no comfort. "Maybe we should just leave," Max suggested, his voice shaky. I could tell he was struggling to maintain his composure. "At least until morning." I wanted to agree, but something about the thought of leaving the house unguarded unsettled me. If we left, what would we come back to? As we debated our options, a cold draft swept through the room, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath misting in the air. "Do you feel that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Max nodded, his eyes wide. "It's freezing in here." But as we looked around, we noticed something else. The scratching had started again, but this time, it was coming from the walls. The sound was faint at first, like something was crawling through the house, searching for us. "It's moving," Max whispered, his voice filled with dread. We stood there, paralyzed, as the scratching grew louder, closer. It moved from wall to wall, creeping up to the ceiling, until it was directly above us. We looked up, horrified, as the ceiling began to bulge, the plaster cracking under the strain of something pressing against it from the other side. Without warning, the ceiling gave way, and a thick, dark sludge began to ooze through the cracks, dripping onto the floor. The smell was overpowering, like rotting flesh mixed with sulfur. Max gagged, covering his mouth as the foul liquid pooled around our feet. "We have to get out of here now," I yelled, grabbing his arm. But before we could move, a low, guttural growl echoed through the house, freezing us in our tracks. The growl was unlike anything I had ever heard, a deep, menacing rumble that reverberated through the walls. The sludge on the floor began to bubble and writhe as if alive, slowly taking shape. In the dim light, we could make out a form emerging from the ooze, long, twisted limbs, a hunched back, and eyes that glowed with an unnatural, malevolent light. The creature's face was a grotesque mask of hatred, its mouth stretching into a wide, toothy grin that dripped with thick, black bile. Max let out a strangled cry, stumbling back as the creature took a step forward, its claws leaving deep gouges in the wooden floor. "Run!" I screamed, shoving him toward the door. We bolted through the hallway, the creature's growl following us as it gave chase. The house seemed to warp around us, the walls narrowing and twisting as if trying to trap us inside. We ran for the front door, but as we reached it, the door slammed shut on its own, locking us in. Max pounded on the door, his fists bruising as he tried to break it down. "It's not going to open," I shouted, pulling him away just as the creature rounded the corner. It was faster than it looked, its long limbs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. We had no choice but to run deeper into the house, the only other option being a gruesome death at the hands of whatever this thing was. We sprinted up the stairs, the creature's guttural breathing echoing behind us. I could feel its presence closing in, the air thick with its putrid stench. We burst into the master bedroom and slammed the door shut, pushing furniture in front of it to block the entrance. But deep down, I knew it was only a temporary barrier. The creature wasn't going to stop, it would find a way in, and when it did, there would be nowhere left to run. The scratching started again, this time from the other side of the bedroom door. But it wasn't just scratching anymore. We could hear the creature speaking, low, incomprehensible whispers that seeped through the wood, filling the room with a dreadful sense of doom. It was taunting us, savoring our fear. "What does it want?" Max asked, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that whatever it wasn't going to leave until it had us. The creature's whispers grew louder, more insistent, slithering through the cracks in the door like a living thing. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and every breath felt like a struggle. Max was on the verge of panic, his eyes wide and glassy as he pressed his back against the wall, as if trying to disappear into it. "We're trapped," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's going to get in, and when it does..." His words trailed off, too afraid to finish the thought. But I couldn't let myself fall into despair, not yet. My mind raced, searching for any possible way out. The bedroom window was an option, but from the second floor, the drop was too high, it would be suicide to jump. As the creature's growls rumbled through the door, an idea struck me. The attic. The entrance was just above us, a small hatch in the ceiling that led to a space I hadn't considered before. "Max, the attic," I said, pointing up. "It might buy us some time." Max hesitated, then nodded, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. I grabbed a nearby chair and climbed up, pushing the hatch open with a creak. The attic was dark, filled with shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. But it was our only option. "Go, I'll hold the door," I urged. Max quickly scrambled up into the attic, and I followed, pulling the hatch closed behind us just as the bedroom door splintered under the creature's assault. The attic was cold and silent, the air thick with dust and the scent of old wood. We crawled through the narrow space, the floorboards creaking under our weight. The creature's scratching grew fainter as we moved further away, but I knew it was only a matter of time before it found us again. "There has to be another way out," Max muttered, his voice tight with fear. But as we reached the far end of the attic, we realized the truth: there was no other exit. We were trapped. The only light came from a small, round window at the far end, offering a view of the backyard and the cursed pet cemetery below. From this height, the graves looked even more sinister, the shadows long and distorted. Max peered out the window, his face pale. "This can't be happening," he whispered, his breath fogging up the glass. "What the hell is that thing? Why is it after us?" I didn't have an answer, but the realization that we had disturbed something ancient and malevolent was sinking in. As I turned to say something, I noticed something strange. In the far corner of the attic, where the shadows were deepest, there was a shape, a small, crude door barely visible against the dark wood. It was old, the wood warped and decaying, as if it had been there for centuries. "Max," I whispered, pointing it out. He followed my gaze, his eyes widening in fear. "What do you think is behind it?" he asked, his voice quivering. We didn't have time to ponder. The scratching had started again, this time from the walls of the attic. The creature was climbing, seeking us out. "We have to open it," I said, moving toward the door. Max grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "Are you crazy? What if it's worse in there?" But we had no choice, the creature was closing in. With a deep breath, I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I gripped the rusted handle. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, dark passage that descended into the depths of the house. A foul stench wafted out, stronger than before, almost knocking me back. But there was something else, a strange, distant light flickering at the end of the passage, beckoning us forward. "We don't have any other option," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Max nodded, his face pale as he followed me into the darkness. The passage was tight, the walls closing in around us as we descended deeper into the house. The air grew colder with each step, and the light ahead flickered like a dying flame. Behind us, the scratching grew louder, more frantic, as the creature pursued us through the walls. But there was no turning back now. We reached the end of the passage, where the light revealed a small, ancient chamber, lined with strange symbols carved into the walls. In the center of the room was a stone altar, covered in dark stains that reeked of blood. But what drew our attention was the box, a small, intricately carved box made of bone, sitting on the altar. It pulsed with a faint, malevolent energy, the source of the light. "What is this place?" Max whispered, his voice barely audible. I could feel the power emanating from the box, a dark force that twisted my stomach into knots. This was the heart of the evil in the house, the source of the creature's power. But as I reached for the box, the creature burst through the wall, its black, twisted form filling the chamber with an overpowering sense of dread. It was too late to run, too late to escape. The creature's eyes locked onto the box, and I realized with horror that it wasn't trying to kill us, it was trying to protect it. The box was the key, the thing that bound the creature to this place. And we had just unleashed it. Max screamed as the creature lunged at us, its claws outstretched. In a last, desperate act, I grabbed the box and hurled it to the ground. The moment it shattered, a blinding light filled the chamber, and the creature let out a blood-curdling scream, its body convulsing as it was torn apart by the force of the breaking spell. But as the light faded and the creature disintegrated, I realized something was terribly wrong. The house began to shake, the walls cracking and crumbling around us. We had broken the seal, unleashed something far worse. The shadows in the chamber seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing, ready to consume everything in their path. "We need to get out," Max shouted, but it was too late. The shadows closed in, swallowing the light, and with it, any hope of escape. The last thing I heard was Max's scream, echoing in the darkness as the house collapsed around us, burying its secrets forever. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.